This week on Dialogue, severe weather and climate change. Is there a connection? Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Now let's meet our guests. Heidi Cullen is a research scientist and correspondent for Climate Central, where she also served as Director of Communications. Previously, she served as the Weather Channel's first on-air climate expert, and Dr. Cullen is also a member of the NOAA Science Advisory Board. Edward Maybach joined George Mason University faculty in 2007 to create the Center for Climate Change Communication. Dr. Maybach is also a principal investigator on several climate change education grants funded by the National Science Foundation and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Dialogue.
Thanks for having us.
Let's do a little background before we delve into our issue. Heidi, tell us about Climate Central. What is the organization? What does it do?
Climate Central is a relatively young nonprofit climate journalism organization, and we basically we are both scientists, climate scientists, and journalists working in the same house, trying to cover climate change and during a time when it's received very little coverage.
And you know, that's an interesting thing. Are you familiar with a study that was done several years ago about science coverage? And do you remember this study? And what it indicated was scientists were bad at communicating to the press, and the press were bad at understanding science. And so what came out? So this sounds like a dream come true in addressing the shortcomings of that study.
You know, it was really meant to be an organization where we could all learn from each other and just help get the message out and help just raise people's overall level of understanding about an issue that's really tough to wrap your arms around, really tough to see, but has tremendous implications for the future.
Ed, tell us about your work at George Mason.
So we established the Center for Climate Change Communication a couple of years ago, as you said, to try to bring sort of a systematic application of social science research to the question of why is the American public having such a hard time understanding the scientific basis of the fact that the climate is changing, that human action is largely to blame, and that it's really in our best interest to start thinking clearly about what decisions we should be making now and going forward.
And what are the biggest barriers that you've uncovered in the couple of years you've been at this?
I would say that the principal barrier is that this has unfortunately become a highly politicized issue. And so what most members of the public actually know about climate change is being filtered, is being brought to them by essentially political actors or voices who are aligned with political actors. And so what we see in the polling data is that 15 years ago, there was no partisan divide on the issue of global warming in America.
15 years ago?
15 years ago, prior to the negotiations that led to the Kyoto Protocol. Mm-hmm. But as soon as that process began, their political actors in the country started to define the issue in political terms. And over the course of the past 15 years, there's been this growing divide among conservatives and liberals' perspectives about what global warming is or isn't, whether or not they believe it's happening or not, whether or not they believe human actions are driving the cause or, creating the situation or not.
I'm wondering how much science literacy factors into this equation as well, in that, in other words, are you more susceptible to political demagoguery if your science acumen is low already?
My colleague at Yale, Tony Leiserowitz, he actually did a very rigorous climate literacy survey last summer, nationally representative of both adults as well as teenagers. And the short answer to your question is no, not really. Segments of the public who believe strongly that the climate is changing have more or less equal climate literacy, as do the segment of the public that has reached just the opposite conclusion.
Well, then, if education is not the answer, science education, what is the answer?
Well, I think one way to think about it is polling shows that in terms of concern about the issue, there's a couple of different pillars that are really, really important in terms of just getting people engaged with the issue and raising their overall concern. The single biggest factor is the belief or the understanding that climate change is fundamentally caused by human actions, by the burning of fossil fuels, by deforestation, so that if you can't bring people down that road and help them make that connection, people aren't going to be concerned about the issue. A couple of other factors that really play into this, and it relates completely to the work that Ed and his colleague Tony are doing, is the fact that people need to trust scientists. They need to trust the science. They need to believe that scientists agree. And those are two areas where we've seen just a lot of work done to erode trust in science, erode trust in the fact that there is a strong consensus around climate scientists.
Erode trust, you could probably put the period there.
Yeah,
This is sort of a bring your own facts era that we're living in.
And the last part, kind of relating to the bring your own facts part, is just coverage. That when coverage of the issue drops, and we've seen it drop precipitously since 2007, concern drops right along with it. Obviously, there's been a lot that's happened since 2007 to explain that, but still, coverage is key.
Now, speaking of coverage, we were talking a little bit before we began rolling the cameras that the biggest story of the last several weeks, until recent scandal with Anthony Weiner and the bad unemployment numbers, has been this so-called severe weather. We've created this thematic headlines, severe weather, to talk about a lot of things happening. Here's what I'm wondering. It sort of reminds me of when we were talking a lot about shark attacks, where the perception was that there were more shark attacks than ever because the news coverage was so significant. But when you compared the data, there were less shark attacks the year of the so-called summer of the shark than there were the previous years. So is this a case of more coverage? Your old stomping grounds, the Weather Channel, the 24/7 news cycle, dramatic pictures supplied by tornadoes destroying entire towns. Is it more coverage, or is it actually more severe weather?
Let's let the climatologist speak to that one, and then, I'll talk about how the public responds to that.
Yeah, because they're definitely both connected. I mean, 2011 has been a very extreme year. 2010 was an extreme year. If you break it down from there.
And let me just, one quick interruption, Heidi. When you say extreme, the ferocity of the storms, what is the extreme element?
So when I say extreme, I mean things like the severity of an event, the intensity, the duration, the frequency, and it kind of comes in all different flavors. So think back to January. We had these mega snowstorms throughout the Northeast. Big
My
news.
back is still sore from those. Yeah.
Big news coverage. I mean, and remember that the weather always interacts with us, with people. So the story gets heightened and dramatized when it happens in major metropolitan areas, when it happens at rush hour, so it very much connects with us. But so January, big snowstorms. In April, massive flooding. We had the tornado outbreak, which came back again in May, and now we've got record heat. So there's a combination of coverage, but there is enough evidence to the point to the fact that 2011 will go down as a year.
So in other words, in this case, there's data behind the hype. This is not
then we can step back and sort of ask the big climate change question, right? So climate, by definition, is the statistics of weather, or as Stephen Colbert likes to say, thousands of tiny little weathers added together. And so we need to think about the climate context and sort of put it into perspective. Now, the research that scientists have done looking at this connection between extreme weather events and climate change is the fact that when the planet heats up, there's more water vapor. When there's more water vapor, there's more fuel for storms. So in the historical observations, in the historical record, things like flooding events, heavy rainfall events, things like heat waves, droughts, we are seeing evidence of those things increasing and following the physics of how we understand climate change.
So making the connection between these killer storms and the warming planet is not a stretch in any way. The data suggests these are, if not a slam dunk, certainly related.
Yeah, I think it's completely fair to say that the events that we're seeing today, we expect to see more of them as we move forward into the future. And we know that they're deadly, and we know that they're costly. So
what's the political pushback on this? Because that's what you seem to often sort through, is that even though there's evidence, people believe other things.
So rather than answer what's the political pushback, I'd actually like to talk about how do people filter the reality of the fact that the weather is changing. Extreme weather events are becoming more frequent. You look back at, over the past 30, 40 years in the United States, and you can see that the frequency of specific types of extreme weather events are becoming more frequent. And any of us who are comfortable at looking at data on a very clear chart can easily see the trend over the past couple of decades. What is projected to go forward is more of the same. In other words, the trend will continue. We will have more extreme weather events going forward. So how do you and I, as individuals, living busy lives, how do we perceive that? Well, by and large, we perceive it based on what others suggest to us that it means. So if you, as a media personality, suggest it means one thing, if a competing voice in the media suggests it means another thing, I, as your viewer, am likely to pay attention to you or perhaps somebody else and say, oh, I get it. I see why why this extreme snowstorm is proof that the globe can't be warming. Because if it's warming, we wouldn't be getting a big snowstorm like snowpocalypse. Or I can see why this extreme heat that we're having in very early June here in Washington, D.C. Is consistent with the fact that the world is warming. As a matter of fact, when I think back upon it, I moved to the Washington area in the early 80s, and I've been here more or less ever since. And it does seem to me, as just one guy who lives in the area, that it does seem to be getting more uncomfortably warm in early June, when it didn't used to be the case until mid-July and August.
We used to have spring before we would melt.
Exactly right.
But this is the troubling part, Ed, is that this shouldn't come down to competing media sources and who you're more comfortable believing. Is there anything we can identify as an unimpeachable fact?
Sure, there's lots of unimpeachable facts, and it shouldn't come down to one pundit saying one thing and another pundit saying another thing. The public places high trust in climate scientists as experts on climate change. That's a great thing, right? Because they are the people in our society who do this research. They are the ones who collect the data, and they are the ones who we should be listening to in terms of an interpretation of what does it mean. But there's a little distressing nuance to the fact that we believe scientists to be credible sources, is the fact that 2/3 of Americans can't name a single living scientist.
Right.
So we don't actually know scientists. By and large, the average American doesn't know and can't name a single scientist. So while we hold them in esteem, while we are inclined to believe what they say, we don't actually have many opportunities to listen to what they say directly. And moreover, no offense to my dear friend Heidi, and as emblematic of the larger community of climate scientists, Heidi's a wonderful communicator, but many climate scientists are more comfortable speaking in the jargon of climate science than in the, in the expressions of ordinary people and the way we speak.
Which doesn't make them different than any other professions who all have their own jargon. Right. And is this part of what you're working on, training scientists to speak English?
Yeah, and I mean, I think I had to go through my own process of learning how to speak English. When I first moved from research science, I was a scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and then when I moved over to the Weather Channel, I was sort of handed this challenge of, okay, so now in a minute and a half, at the most, explain climate change. And as a scientist, that was definitely not my strength. And it was just, for me, this great opportunity to sit down and say, what do people really need to know about this issue? How does it impact them where they live right now? And how can we help them better see it? Because, like I said, climate is this statistical construct. It's not really real, but weather is real. And so I think this whole discussion, and the reason why extreme weather is put in such a spotlight, because it's one of the few moments where scientists can take an event and say, our data, our understanding of the physics suggests that we're going to see these kinds of things more often.
No longer theoretical, it's in your backyard.
Yep.
Along those lines, a lot of coverage, and cover of Newsweek, the Sharon Begley article, Weather Panic. I guess I should show it for benefit of people at home who haven't seen it. This is the new, what I want to comment on is the tagline here that says, "This is the new normal, and we're hopelessly unprepared." I guess two parts to this question. Is it the new normal, and how prepared are we?
I'll say that putting a tornado on the cover is probably not great messaging, because tornadoes are one of the few extremes where it's really, really hard for us to make a connection between climate change and tornadoes, because they're such small events, they're difficult to model, and right now the record is really hard to read because Doppler radar didn't come along until the 1990s, so our historical data for tornadoes is not great.
So the easier things are hurricanes?
Things like floods, things like droughts, heat waves. temperature, rainfall data, much cleaner data to work with than something like a tornado, which is really, really tough to simulate with a model because there's all of these different ingredients. We know that all weather is now born into a warmer, moister environment. So we know that climate change is in play, but to be able to say whether tornadoes will become more intense, more frequent, whether Tornado Alley will grow, whether the season for tornadoes will increase, that stuff we're just not sure about yet.
Beyond tornadoes, the preparation part, is this a new normal? Are all those other things you talk about just something we're going to have to learn to live with for the foreseeable future?
I don't know how Ed feels about this, but I love the term the new normal because I think it's really representative of what we're dealing with, and the fact that when we take climatological data, not to be too nerdy about it, but we take 30-year time slices, and those 30-year time slices are dramatically different. So we need to just realize that the climate with which much of our infrastructure, which is quite old at this point, was built for is not equipped for the new normal that we're going to be dealing with.
What do you think of the term, and what do the people you poll think of the term?
I like the term as well. We haven't asked members of the public what they think about the term, whether they think that's a fair representation. The reason I like the term is because it does suggest we should be doing things, thinking about what things should we be doing differently. There's a basic human tendency, however, not to think very far into the future, not to plan very far into the future, except in certain ways. I'm sure you insure your home against fire. I certainly do. Heidi probably does as well. We're all very much used to thinking in those terms, buying insurance to protect us from bad things that could happen. But my neighbors on my street, none of them had generators in their homes to help power our homes in the case of electricity outages until after Snowmageddon, and when we all were out of heat and electricity and light for 2 or 3 or 4 days. A really amazing proportion of my neighbors bought these home generators. So the question of the new normal begs, the framing of the new normal begs the question, well, what should we be doing differently? As I said, we're not very good at planning far into the future, but at least it's helpful to call the question about what should we be doing differently.
Let's spend some time on that question. There are things that you can think about. If it's going to be as hot as it today, we might be heading toward a record. While we sit in an air-conditioned studio, excuse me, people are frying eggs on the sidewalk, right? We could be looking at another record. And so you think of things like just the strain on the power grid if more air conditioning is used. I've read some notions that runways might have to be longer because you achieve less lift aerodynamically during really hot weather. Could you give us some insight into, canals in lower Manhattan is another one I've heard, that the new Venice. What are the things that you are anticipating that the train's already left the station? This isn't about Congress passing some new pieces of legislation and we can avoid all this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to take a short step back, National Research Council, National Academy of Sciences, was asked by Congress to engage in a report to look at America's climate choices, what we can do about climate change. And the big takeaway from the report was that climate change is real. It's predominantly caused by human actions, and that we need to start working on it. And the sooner we start working on it, the better, because it's cheaper to make these infrastructure investments up front. And so you look at a city like New York or Philly, where the infrastructure is upwards of 100 years old, and then you've got to think about increased strain on the power grid. A city like New York is incredibly worried about something like that. Even just flooding events, storm surges from a hurricane, worst case scenario, to just routine flooding events that, back in the day wouldn't have led to, subway shutdowns, but as they become more frequent and more intense, we've really got to think about this. So you can look in every community and you can identify those places where there's these Achilles heels that we just need to make the investment in.
One theory, Ed, that I've heard is that one reason that people respond almost with a glazed overlook to this whole discussion is because it feels so overwhelming.
It's absolutely overwhelming. A lot of the messaging, the messaging consistent with the climate science has been relatively apocalyptic. It's scary. We don't like to deal with fear unless there are options available to us to reduce the threat, so that we can turn back to the things that we want to be spending our time doing.
And do we have options?
It's a great question. I would actually suggest one of our options is to be a whole lot less frightening in the way we try to explain the issue of climate change to the American people. I think that's a really important insight, that fear isn't the answer. It tends to just get people to turn away. The work that we're doing with weathercasters, for example, Heidi and I are working with Jim Gandy at WLTX in Columbia, South Carolina. That's part of the CBS affiliate station in Columbia. And Jim and his weather team are collaborating with us to develop educational materials that will help their viewers understand the connection between unusual weather events in Columbia and how that is connected to the larger pattern, the changes as a result of the changing global climate. That kind of concrete explanation. Heidi talked a moment ago about statistical abstractions. That stuff makes people's eyes glaze over. But the concrete...
Did you see that in my eyes, Heidi? I did not mean to glaze over.
You didn't glaze over, but we know, actually, we have evidence to show that numbers, in essence, numbers numb people.
Right. Statistics are hard to talk about.
Statistics are hard to comprehend because people... it numbs people to what's actually being said. Conversely, concrete explanations based in stories, ideally, stories about things I care about, where I live, how the weather here in Washington, D.C. or Columbia, South Carolina or Arcata, California, how unusual weather events here are connected to the larger pattern. That's the kind of information that actually helps people connect the dots to understand how their lived experience is connected to something larger that typically only gets described in terms of statistical abstractions.
And it seems, at least in that regard, you're working in it with an advantage. People talk about the weather all the time.
Absolutely.
In their personal lives, weather is on the daily menu. Let me ask you about the terminology, the climate change terminology. I have a page here from the 2002 memorandum that Frank Luntz wrote to President Bush. And it says this, and I'm amazed that when talking to people about this subject matter that people aren't as familiar with this memo as you would think they would be. But Frank wrote this: the terminology in the upcoming environmental debate needs refinement, starting with global warming. He goes on to say it's time for us to start talking about climate change instead of global warming. He doesn't do it as a climate scientist. He says this: climate change is less frightening than global warming. As one focus group participant noted, climate change sounds like you're going from Pittsburgh to Fort Lauderdale, while global warming has catastrophic connotations attached to it. Climate change suggests a more controllable and less emotional challenge. Where do you weigh in on the notion of what's the most useful terminology? It seems in this case that coming from a particular political persuasion, Luntz is suggesting that climate change is friendlier to the Republican Party.
So we and other social scientists have been looking at this exact issue recently to figure out whether or not there is a better term to be using in public engagement, public education efforts. I could tell you what we know. We know that people who believe strongly that the climate is changing, that human activity is in large part to blame, that this is a serious threat to us as people. It's not just a plants, penguins, and polar bears problem, that they tend to prefer the term global warming. Probably for the very same reasons that Frank Luntz outlined in that memo. Namely, they get that they are scared by global warming. They see this as a scary threat to human civilization, and frankly, they even internalize that threat. They see it as a threat to themselves and their loved ones. Almost everybody else says, in response to our surveys, they say, doesn't matter. No preference regarding term. Happy to talk about global warming, happy to talk about climate change. Other people's research, however, has uncovered something I think that's very important. We're not entirely sure what it means yet, but I'm pretty sure it's important, and that is in surveys of the public, when people are either randomly assigned to answer the question, essentially, so is global warming occurring, is climate change occurring?
Same question, different term.
Same question, only changing out the term. Democrats answer the question the same, regardless of term. Republicans, however, there's a 20 percentage point difference between those who say global warming is happening, they are 20 percentage points less likely to say global warming is happening than they are likely to say that climate change is happening.
You don't even see a 20-point difference on Sarah Palin between Republicans and Democrats.
From a public polling perspective, that's a huge finding. We're now looking into what it is, what are the mental associations with those terms, global warming and climate change, to see whether or not, what Frank Luntz uncovered in the early 90s is still, in fact, operative today, and that Republicans, for example, are the reason they're more likely to say that climate change is occurring is because they see it as less of a threat, a less scary problem, one possibly in which is not an acknowledgement that human activity is fundamentally driving the problem.
Heidi, the most fascinating thing to me about this Luntz memo is that it's the only case I could think of where someone motivated by a political agenda has put forward a term to challenge science, essentially, indirectly, and scientists agree they like the term better.
It's so funny because, yeah, I remember when that memo came out, and it was one of the questions that when I was at the Weather Channel we took very, very seriously. How should we characterize and familiarize our audience with this issue? Should we call it global warming? Should we call it climate change? We went with climate change, and it is the term that scientists like better in the sense that it's more all-encompassing. What we call the temperature trend, the Earth warming up, that's global warming. And then extreme weather events, all of these things that are byproducts of that warming fall under this heading of climate change. So for a scientist, it works both ways, but it is fascinating to see the political implications.
I'm very sorry to ask this question with 30 seconds remaining, but I had a thought that maybe we should give some practical advice to individuals watching and listening about preparation. I remember the Y2K closets that everybody was building for that apocalypse. Quickly, in 10 or 15 seconds each, what should people do if this is the new normal? Prepare their homes, prepare themselves.
My 15-second answer would be to work within your own community, to work locally, to look at infrastructure issues, ways that you can invest and protect your community, and also to think about ways to just reduce your overall energy consumption. There's a lot of simple things that you can do that would make a big difference.
Quick final thought?
Yeah, Ed? I think those are really good answers, and particularly because Heidi's recommending that people look closest to home, where we have the highest investment and we're most comfortable working.
Well, thank you. Fascinating conversation. I hope we shed some light on some tough questions. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.